People like you don't belong here, Daniel Brooks said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the soft jazz and crystal clinks of the dining room. And for a split second, the entire space seemed to tilt toward that single sentence. Ava Johnson didn't look up, not immediately, her fingers resting lightly against the cool rim of her glass as if grounding herself in something steady while the weight of the moment settled around her. The chandelier light above scattered across polished marble and silverware, catching in the silence that followed, thick and watchful. Daniel straightened his jacket, a small smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth, the kind that came from years of deciding who mattered and who didn't within these walls. This is a private dining section, he added, sliding the leather-bound check across the table with deliberate precision, the total printed clearly. For $1,200. An amount meant to say more than words ever could. A couple at. The next table paused mid-conversation. A server hesitated near the bar, but no one spoke. No one interrupted, as if the room had collectively agreed to let this unfold. Ava finally lifted her eyes, calm, unreadable, not defensive, not angry, just present in a way that made the moment feel heavier, more deliberate. She glanced at the check, then back at Daniel, and for a heartbeat, there was something almost reflective in her gaze, like she was seeing not just him, but everything behind him. The assumptions, the quiet permissions, the unspoken rules. Daniel let out a soft chuckle, mistaking her silence for hesitation. "If you can't afford this," he said, tapping the bill once with his finger, "I'll quit right now." The words landing with a casual confidence that suggested he had never once been wrong about someone like her. The air tightened, subtle but undeniable, like a held breath stretching just a second too long. Ava's hand moved slowly, not rushed, not uncertain, reaching into her purse with a kind of quiet intention that didn't match the tension in the room. The faint rustle of fabric, the soft click of something being opened, every small sound suddenly amplified against the stillness. Daniel crossed his arms, already half-turned as if the outcome had been decided before the moment began, as if her story had already been written in his mind. But Ava didn't rush to prove anything, didn't argue, didn't explain. She simply placed a single black card onto the table, the matte surface catching a narrow beam of light, understated but unmistakable. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. No reaction, no shift, just that card resting between them like a quiet contradiction. Then footsteps echoed from the entrance, quick, purposeful, cutting through the room's fragile balance, and a man in a tailored suit approached with urgency barely contained, his eyes locking onto Ava with immediate recognition. "Ms. Johnson," he said, voice tight with respect, "the board is waiting for you upstairs." And just like that, the silence changed, not broken, but transformed, as if every person in the room suddenly realized they had been witnessing something far larger than a simple check. And Daniel's smirk faltered, not completely, not yet, but enough for doubt to slip in where certainty had always lived. Daniel did not move at first, but something in his posture shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like a crack forming beneath a polished surface that had never been tested before. His eyes flicked from the man in the suit back to Ava, searching for something that would restore the version of reality he was used to, something predictable, something that made sense within the rules he had always followed. But Ava remained exactly as she was, composed, her hand resting lightly on the table, her gaze steady without challenge, without triumph, just presence. The suited man stood beside her now, slightly out of breath, holding a tablet close to his chest, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly against his cufflinks. "We are running behind schedule," he added, softer this time, as if aware of the tension wrapping itself around the room. A server near the bar lowered a tray slowly, careful not to make a sound, while a couple across the room exchanged a glance that lingered just a second too long. Daniel cleared his throat, a reflex more than a decision, and stepped forward, attempting to reclaim the space that suddenly felt unfamiliar. "There must be some confusion," he said, his voice measured, but lacking the sharp certainty it carried moments ago. Ava's eyes met his again, not confrontational, not forgiving, simply acknowledging. She picked up the black card, turned it once between her fingers, then placed it back down with quiet finality. The small motion echoed louder than it should have, like a punctuation mark in a sentence no one had expected. No confusion. The suited man replied before Ava could speak, his tone respectful but firm, his attention never leaving her. Ms. Johnson is expected upstairs for the final review. The word review seemed to land differently, heavier, drawing invisible lines between what had just happened and what was about to unfold. Daniel's gaze dropped, almost involuntarily, to the card on the table. And for the first time, he actually looked at it, not as a challenge, not as a symbol, but as something real. The name, the finish, the quiet authority it carried without explanation. A flicker of recognition passed across his face, faint but undeniable. Ava stood then, smooth and unhurried, her chair sliding back with a soft whisper against the floor. She adjusted her jacket, a simple motion, but one that seemed to settle everything around her into place. The room did not return to normal, it simply watched, held in that suspended moment where perception begins to shift. Daniel opened his mouth as if to say something, perhaps an apology, perhaps a correction, but the words did not come, not because he did not know what to say, but because for the first time, he understood that whatever he said would not change what had already been revealed. Ava did not wait for it. She stepped past him, close enough that he could feel the quiet confidence in her movement, the absence of hesitation, the absence of doubt. The suited man followed half a step behind, already turning toward the private elevator at the end of the hall. As the door slid open with a soft chime, Ava paused just long enough to glance back, not at Daniel alone, but at the entire room, at the servers, the guests, the silence that had allowed the moment to exist. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, only clarity, as if she had seen exactly what she needed to see. Then she stepped inside, and as the elevator doors closed, the reflection of the dining room folded into the polished steel, leaving Daniel standing exactly where he had been, but no longer quite the same. The elevator rose in near silence, a smooth, controlled ascent that felt almost disconnected from the tension left behind on the dining floor, and Ava stood still inside the mirrored space, her reflection repeating endlessly around her, calm, composed, but carrying something deeper beneath the surface. The suited man beside her adjusted his tie once, then glanced toward her, not with curiosity, but with quiet respect, the kind that had been earned long before this moment. "They have been waiting for your final decision," he said carefully, his voice measured, as if every word carried weight now. Ava did not respond right away, her eyes fixed on the changing floor numbers, each soft chime marking a shift not just in location, but in consequence. Downstairs, Daniel Brooks remained frozen near the table, the noise of the restaurant slowly returning around him, but not for him, not yet. A glass clinked somewhere in the distance, a low murmur of conversation resumed, but it all sounded muted, distant, like he was standing behind a wall he had not seen before. One of the servers approached cautiously, holding a small receipt, unsure whether to speak, unsure where the boundaries now existed. "Sir," the server said quietly, offering the slip with both hands. The payment went through. Daniel took it without looking, his fingers tightening slightly against the paper, not out of anger, but confusion, the kind that came when certainty unraveled too quickly to catch. He glanced down, just for a moment, and saw the name printed clearly, unmistakable, a confirmation that required no explanation. Upstairs, the elevator doors opened into a private corridor lined with glass walls and soft recessed lighting, the air cooler, quieter, deliberate. A group of executives stood near the end of the hall, their conversations stopping the instant Ava stepped forward. The shift was immediate, visible, a subtle straightening of posture, a recalibration of tone. "Ms. Johnson," one of them said, stepping forward with a nod that carried both welcome and expectation. Ava walked past them at an even pace, not rushed, not slow, her presence filling the space without effort. And as she entered the conference room, the city stretched behind her through floor-to-ceiling windows, miles of skyline reflecting the fading light of late afternoon. She placed her hand lightly on the back of the chair at the head of the table, but did not sit yet, her gaze moving across the room, taking in each face, each expression, each layer of anticipation. "Before we begin," she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying easily without force. I made an unannounced visit downstairs. A ripple moved through the room, small but unmistakable, eyes shifting, shoulders tightening, the atmosphere sharpening. Back below, Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that came after holding something too long. And for the first time, he looked around the room not as its manager, but as someone seeing it from the outside, noticing the glances, the silence that had not defended, the moment that had passed without interruption. The receipt in his hand felt heavier now, not because of its value, but because of what it represented, a line crossed without understanding its cost. Upstairs, Ava finally pulled out the chair and sat, the soft sound grounding the room into stillness. What I experienced, she continued, her tone unchanged, was not about service or standards or procedure. She paused, just long enough for the words to settle, for the weight of them to take shape. It was about something deeper. The room remained silent, attentive, every person aware that whatever came next would not just define a decision, but reveal something far more lasting than policy or profit. No one spoke after that, not because they did not have questions, but because something in Ava's tone made it clear that this was not a discussion. It was a mirror, and everyone in that room was now standing in front of it. The city lights outside began to flicker on one by one, reflecting against the glass walls like quiet witnesses as she leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands resting calmly on the table, not defensive, not aggressive, just present. One of the senior executives shifted in his seat, clearing his throat as if to regain control of the moment, but the words did not come easily. Our standards have always been, he started, then stopped, the sentence dissolving before it could take shape. Ava did not interrupt him, did not correct him. She simply waited, and that waiting carried more weight than any argument. Downstairs, Daniel finally moved, a slow step back from the table, then another, his eyes scanning the room again, but this time differently, noticing the small details he had ignored before, the hesitation in the server's posture, the way a guest avoided eye contact, the subtle distance that had formed around him without anyone saying a word. He walked toward the bar, not with authority, but with something closer to uncertainty, and rested his hand lightly against the polished surface as if grounding himself. The bartender glanced at him, then looked away, not out of disrespect, but out of discomfort, as if the balance between roles had shifted in a way no one knew how to address. Upstairs, Ava's gaze moved across the executives once more, steady, deliberate. Policies can be written, she said quietly, her voice even. Training can be scheduled, procedures can be updated. She paused, just long enough for the rhythm of the sentence to settle. But culture reveals itself when no one thinks they are being evaluated. The room tightened again, not with tension, but with recognition. Another executive leaned forward slightly, hands clasped together, his expression more cautious now, more aware. "What are you recommending?" he asked, his voice lower than before. Ava tilted her head slightly, considering the question, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood what the answer would require. "I am not recommending anything yet," she replied, her tone calm but precise. "I am describing what I saw." The distinction hung in the air, subtle but undeniable. Downstairs, Daniel exhaled again, longer this time, his reflection staring back at him from the mirrored shelves behind the bar, not as the confident manager who had controlled every detail of this space, but as someone confronted with a version of himself he had never examined. He straightened slightly, adjusting his jacket out of habit, but the gesture felt different now, less about appearance, more about trying to hold something together. A server approached him again, hesitant but present, as if waiting for direction that no longer came as easily as before. Daniel looked at the server, then at the table where Ava had been sitting, the empty chair still angled slightly away from the table, a quiet reminder that something had shifted and would not return to the way it was. Upstairs, Ava leaned forward just slightly, her presence drawing the room back into focus. "What happens next," she continued, her voice steady, "is not about correcting one moment." She let the sentence settle before finishing it. "It is about understanding why that moment felt acceptable to everyone who witnessed it." The silence that followed was deeper now, not uncertain, but reflective, as if each person in the room was beginning to see not just the situation, But their place within it, the silence in the room did not break. It deepened, settling into something heavier than tension, something closer to realization, and Ava let it linger, not to pressure them, but to give space for what had already been said to take root. Outside, the skyline glowed brighter now, reflections stretching across the glass like quiet reminders of how far influence could reach when it was used without awareness. One of the executives finally shifted forward, his fingers interlaced tightly, the small movement revealing more than his words would. "If what you saw reflects the environment downstairs," he said carefully, "then it reflects on all of us." Ava's gaze moved to him, not approving, not critical, simply acknowledging the truth in that statement. "It does," she replied softly, her voice steady. "Because culture is not created in boardrooms, it is revealed in everyday moments when no one is watching." The words settled. Like a quiet verdict, not spoken in anger, but in clarity. Downstairs, Daniel remained by the bar, but his posture had changed again, less rigid now, more aware, as if he was standing in a space he no longer fully understood. A server approached him once more, this time with less hesitation, but still cautious. "Do you need anything, sir?" The question simple, but layered now with something unspoken. Daniel looked at the server, really looked this time, noticing the way the young man held himself, the slight tension in his shoulders, the expectation of dismissal or correction that never needed to be said out loud. "No," Daniel answered quietly, the words softer than it had ever been before, and for a moment, neither of them moved, both aware that something in that exchange had shifted, even if neither could fully name it yet. Upstairs, Ava leaned back slightly, her hand still resting calmly on the table, her presence unchanged, grounded. "Accountability is not about punishment," she continued, her tone even, measured. "It is about awareness, and what we choose to do once that awareness exists." Another pause followed, but this one felt different, less uncertain, more focused. A woman seated near the end of the table nodded almost imperceptibly, her expression thoughtful, as if connecting something she had seen before but never fully understood. "So what happens next?" she asked, her voice quieter now, but clearer. Ava's eyes moved across the room again, taking in each face, each reaction, the subtle shifts in posture, in breath, in understanding. "Next," Ava said slowly, "we decide whether what happened downstairs was an exception or a reflection." The distinction landed with precision, drawing a line that could not be ignored. Downstairs, Daniel turned his head toward the dining room. Watching as guests continued their meals, conversations resumed, the rhythm of service slowly re-establishing itself. But beneath it, he could feel something different, something that would not simply fade with time. He thought about the moment again, the words he had chosen, the assumptions behind them, the silence that had followed, and for the first time, he questioned not just what he had said, but why it had felt so natural to say it. He straightened again, not out of habit this time, but out of something closer to intention, and took a step away from the bar, his gaze moving toward the table where Ava had sat, the empty chair still there, unchanged, but no longer unnoticed. Upstairs, Ava leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering just enough to draw the room in closer. "Because if it is a reflection," she said, her tone calm but firm, "then the real issue is not what one person did. It is what everyone allowed to exist without question." The room held that truth in silence, not resisting it, not deflecting it, but beginning, slowly, to accept it. The room did not move. It settled, like something invisible had just been placed at the center of the table, and no one wanted to be the first to touch it. Ava remained still, her breathing slow, controlled, her gaze no longer searching the room, but resting somewhere deeper, as if she had already said everything that needed to be said, and now the weight of it belonged to them. Outside, a faint reflection of passing headlights traced across the glass, moving quietly from one edge of the room to the other, like time continuing without interruption, indifferent to realization. One executive leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still again. The small gesture revealing a mind turning faster than his body could show. Another lowered her eyes briefly, not in avoidance, but in thought, as if replaying something she had witnessed before, something she had once ignored. Ava's voice did not come immediately, and that absence of sound became its own presence, filling the space more effectively than any argument. Downstairs, the rhythm of the restaurant had resumed on the surface, plates moving, orders called, conversations rising and falling, but underneath it, a different layer existed now, quieter, more aware. Daniel stood near the center of the room, no longer anchored to the bar, no longer positioned above the flow, but within it, as if he had stepped into a current he had never noticed before. He watched a server greet a new guest, the tone polite, measured, and for a brief second, he wondered how many interactions had passed through this space shaped by assumptions he had never questioned. His jaw tightened slightly, not from anger, but from recognition, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but in fragments that slowly align. Upstairs, Ava finally shifted, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the table, a grounding motion, subtle, controlled. "There is always a moment," she said quietly, her voice lower. Now, but clearer in the stillness. When someone notices something is not right, the words landed gently, but they carried further than their volume suggested. A few eyes lifted, drawn back to her without effort. "And in that moment," she continued, "there is a choice, to speak or to stay silent." The distinction hung between them, simple, undeniable. One of the younger executives swallowed, his posture tightening, as if the sentence had found its way directly to him. Downstairs, Daniel turned slowly toward the entrance, where a new couple had just stepped inside, their movements hesitant, scanning the room in the same way Ava had earlier, measuring whether they belonged before they had even been welcomed. He took a step forward, then paused, the instinct to approach colliding with something else, something unfamiliar, something that asked him to look first, to see before deciding. The pause lasted only a second, but it stretched longer in his mind. Upstairs, Ava's gaze softened slightly, not in sympathy, but in understanding. "What I witnessed," she said, her tone steady, "was not one voice, it was many silences." The sentence settled deeper than the others, not sharp, not accusatory, but complete. No one responded, not because they disagreed, but because there was nothing to add without confronting themselves. The air felt different now, not tense, not heavy, but clear in a way that made everything visible. Ava leaned back once more, her shoulders relaxed, her presence unchanged, and let the silence return, not as emptiness, but as space for something new to form. The room held its breath in a different way now, not waiting, but understanding, and Ava let that understanding settle before she spoke again, her voice quieter, but carrying further than before. "Tonight was not an accident," she said, each word placed carefully, without force, without hesitation. It was a reflection of what has been allowed to exist for a long time. No one interrupted, not even with a shift or a breath, because the truth in that sentence did not invite debate, it invited recognition. One of the senior executives lowered his gaze, his shoulders dropping slightly as if something inside him had finally given way, while another leaned forward, her fingers pressed together, her expression no longer guarded but open, ready to hear what came next. Ava's eyes moved across them slowly, not searching for agreement, but measuring awareness, and what she saw was enough. Downstairs, Daniel stood near the entrance now, watching as the couple hesitated just inside the door, their posture uncertain, their eyes scanning the room in quiet calculation, the same way Ava had earlier, and for the first time, he did not see them as customers to assess, but as people deciding whether they would be welcomed or dismissed. He took a step forward, slower this time, more deliberate, and when he spoke, his tone was different, not rehearsed, not controlled, but real. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady but softer than before. "Welcome in." The words were simple, but they carried something new, something he had not offered before, and the couple's shoulders relaxed just slightly in response. Upstairs, Ava leaned forward, her presence drawing the room back into focus once more. "What happens next," she continued, "is not about removing one person or rewriting one policy." She paused, allowing the distinction to form clearly. "It is about deciding who we choose to be when no one is watching." The sentence settled deeper than any before it, because it left no space for avoidance, only choice. One of the executives nodded slowly, the movement small but meaningful, while another exhaled quietly, as if releasing something that had been held too long. Then we need to act, someone said from the far end of the table, the first statement that carried direction rather than defense. Ava's gaze shifted toward the voice, calm, steady. Yes, she replied. But action without understanding becomes performance, and performance does not last. The room absorbed that, the difference between reaction and change becoming clearer with each passing second. Downstairs, Daniel remained near the entrance for a moment longer, watching the couple settle into their table, noticing how the server approached them, how the tone of the interaction felt, and for the first time, he paid attention not to efficiency, not to speed, but to presence. He turned slightly, his eyes moving across the room, seeing it differently now, not as a system he controlled, but as a space shaped by every small decision made within it. Upstairs, Ava finally leaned back again, her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture unchanged, but the atmosphere around her different now, less tense, more grounded. You do not fix culture in a single night, she said softly, her voice steady. But you can begin to change it in a single moment, if you are willing to see clearly. The words settled into the room like something permanent, something that would not fade once the meeting ended, and for the first time since she had entered, the silence that followed did not feel heavy. It felt purposeful, as if something had shifted, not just in the room, but in the people within it. The decision did not arrive with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a shift in air pressure that everyone could feel but no one could see. Ava sat still, watching the room not for agreement, but for alignment, and what she saw was enough to move forward. One of the executives reached for a tablet, not hesitantly this time, but with intention, pulling up internal reports, performance reviews, customer feedback logs. The layers of information that had always been there, but rarely examined through the lens now placed before them. We need a full internal audit, he said, his voice steady, no longer defensive, but resolved. Not just operations, but behavior, patterns, decision-making. Another nodded, adding quietly, and leadership accountability at every level. The words did not clash, they built on each other, forming something more cohesive than reaction, something closer to direction. Ava listened without interruption, her presence unchanged, allowing the shift to belong to them rather than to her. Downstairs, Daniel stood near the center of the room again, but this time not as the person directing movement, rather as someone learning to observe it. His eyes following a server as she approached a table, her tone warm, attentive, her posture open. He noticed the difference immediately, not because it was extraordinary, but because he had never truly paid attention to it before. The realization settled slowly, not as guilt, but as awareness, and with it came something quieter, something more difficult to ignore. He turned toward the host's stand, where a young employee stood checking reservations, her movements precise, careful, and for a moment, he simply watched, seeing the effort behind each small action, the attention, the intention. Upstairs, Ava finally spoke again, her voice calm, steady, but now carrying a sense of closure. Change does not begin with policy, she said, her eyes moving across the room one last time. It begins with what you choose to notice. The sentence did not land as instruction, but as truth, something that could not be undone once seen. One of the executives exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, his expression no longer guarded, but thoughtful. Then we have been missing more than we realized, he admitted. Ava gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because recognition was the first step, not the last. Downstairs, Daniel moved again, this time toward a table where a guest had just been seated, his steps measured, deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the sharp edges it once had, only clarity. Is everything to your liking so far? The question simple, but different now, shaped by something he had not considered before. The guest looked up, slightly surprised, then nodded, and Daniel held that moment a fraction longer, understanding that connection was not something enforced, it was something created. Upstairs, the room had shifted completely, not into relief, but into responsibility. and Ava could see it in the way they held themselves, the way they listened, the way they no longer searched for quick solutions. "We will begin immediately," one of them said, not as a promise, but as a commitment. Ava rose slowly from her chair, the motion quiet but definitive, signaling not an end, but a transition. She did not need to say more, because what needed to be understood had already been made clear. As she turned toward the window, the city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass, a reminder that influence did not end within these walls. It extended far beyond them. And for the first time that evening, the room did not feel like a place of evaluation, but a place where something had begun to change. The meeting ended without applause, without handshakes, without anything that would signal completion. Because what had started in that room was not something that could be closed with a gesture. Ava stepped away from the table and moved toward the window one last time. The city stretching out beneath her, lights pulsing in quiet rhythm, each one representing a life, a story, a moment where someone would decide whether to be seen or overlooked. Behind her, the executives did not rush to leave. They remained seated or standing in place, absorbing what had settled into them, not as pressure, but as responsibility. Something that would follow them beyond this floor, beyond this night. Downstairs, the restaurant carried on, but not as it had before. The same music played, the same plates moved, but the atmosphere held a different texture now, softer, more aware. Daniel stood near the entrance again, not out of duty, but out of choice, his posture steady, his movements slower, more intentional. A guest walked in, alone this time, scanning the room with that familiar hesitation, that quiet calculation of belonging. And Daniel noticed it immediately, not as a detail to manage, but as a moment to respond to. He stepped forward, meeting the guest halfway, his voice calm, genuine. "Good evening. Welcome." And he held the eye contact just long enough to let the words mean something. The guest nodded. A small shift in their shoulders, a release of tension that might have gone unnoticed before, but not now. Daniel guided them to a table without rushing, without assumption, simply present in the interaction. And when he stepped back, he paused, just for a second, recognizing the difference not in the action, but in the awareness behind it. Upstairs, Ava turned from the window and walked toward the door, the quiet sound of her heels against the floor marking a transition more than an ending. One of the executives looked up as she passed, his expression no longer guarded, but thoughtful. "Thank you," he said, not formally, not as a courtesy, but as acknowledgement. Ava gave a small nod, not accepting praise, but recognizing intention, and continued without slowing. The hallway outside remained still, the soft lighting unchanged, but something in the space felt clearer, as if what had been spoken inside the room had extended beyond its walls. The elevator doors opened with a gentle chime, and Ava stepped inside, the mirrored surface reflecting her once more, not as someone who had proven a point, but as someone who had revealed one. As the doors closed, the reflection of the corridor narrowed, then disappeared, leaving only her and the quiet hum of descent. Below, Daniel moved through the room again, not correcting, not controlling, but observing, adjusting in small ways that would not be written in any policy, but would shape every interaction that followed. He stopped briefly. At the table where Ava had sat earlier, the chair now aligned neatly, the space reset, but not erased. And for a moment, he simply stood there, understanding that some moments do not leave marks you can see, but they change everything you do afterward. Outside, the night air settled over the city, steady, constant, and inside, without announcement, without recognition, something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly enough to last.